final frontier.
What speed?
Name of the place we're going is Genesis.
The most destructive force ever created.
Against an arch-enemy, a mission of loyalty and sacrifice.
Just the turn of luck I have been waiting for. Fire, Mr. Scott.
Get out of there!
Good shooting, Mr. Scott.
If we don't help each other, we'll die here. And that's the way it shall be.
Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. Saturday at 5:50 on BBC One.
Well, back to tonight on BBC One, and in a quarter of an hour, Pam Rhodes visits Clovelly in Devon and finds out about the traditional way of life that still exists in the holiday village. That's in Summer Praise. Well, first, at 6:10, the news with Chris Lowe.
President Clinton promises action against the Somalis who killed 4 American soldiers in an ambush. Their truck was blown up by a landmine and gunmen then opened fire. Monetary union right or wrong? Senior Conservatives clash over the future of Europe. And England on the verge of defeat, bamboozled by Australia's spinners. Good evening. President Clinton has said everything possible was being done to find out who was responsible for the attack in Somalia in which 4 American soldiers died. He said he was consulting with America's UN allies about what action to take. The UN Special Representative in Somalia has blamed the fugitive faction leader General Aidid. The attack happened in the capital Mogadishu as the soldiers travelled from the US Hunter Air Base to the airport. Their vehicle was blown up by a landmine in the Medina area. Gunmen then attacked the rest of the convoy with grenades and machine gun fire.
A landmine in a quiet suburban street was the means for the latest attack by General Aidid's gunmen on United Nations peacekeepers in Mogadishu. 3 American servicemen travelling in a jeep died instantly in the explosion, which left an 8-foot-wide crater in the road. A 4th soldier died later in hospital. Reinforcements were quickly on the scene, with helicopter gunships providing air cover. The Marines trying to clear the debris and find the gunmen who opened up on the convoy after the explosion.
Initial reports indicated that at approximately 9 a.m. this morning, a 6-vehicle convoy was traveling from Hunter Base to the airport in Mogadishu, and 4 U.S. soldiers were in a vehicle that apparently ran over a landmine.
For hours, the soldiers came under sporadic sniper fire from the surrounding houses. This new weapon, the landmine, is especially deadly to the UN here, as even the heavily armed convoys they use to move around the city are now vulnerable. Helicopter gunships, the most effective weapon the UN has, may now be the only safe way to travel in Mogadishu. They're also the most likely means of delivering the retribution the UN now clearly feels it must inflict on General Aidid, to prove it hasn't, once again, lost control of the streets to the warlords whose power it came here to break. Roger Hearing, BBC News, Nairobi.
The former Prime Minister, Sir Edward Heath, has said John Major would be wrong if he were to revive proposals for a common currency, which Europeans could use if they chose. Downing Street says Treasury ministers are to consider the option following last week's problems in the European exchange rate mechanism. But in an interview with the BBC, Sir Edward said what businessmen wanted was a single currency that everyone had to use.
Although thoughts about monetary union and currency turmoil weren't uppermost in the Prime Minister's mind yesterday at the cricket, his original plan for a common currency, unveiled 3 years ago when he was Chancellor, might be looked at again. Then he proposed the idea of a hard écu, which rather than replacing existing currencies, would coexist alongside them, with its success entirely dependent on how many businesses chose to use it. But it was dismissed then, and supporters of a single currency are still dismissive.
I don't think it'll work, no. And what's the point of having a common currency and then having all the complications of 12 other countries? Businessmen want a single currency. Why don't the politicians pay some attention to businessmen?
But support today came from the former Chancellor, who said this might be the way ahead.
The hard écu is a much more gradual, much more evolutionary, much more voluntary approach to the idea of monetary union in Europe. It was John Major's idea. I think it was a good idea.
The hard écu is a discredited idea. It's very reminiscent of John Major's earlier sayings that he wanted the pound to be the reserve currency of Europe, the strongest currency within Europe. It's all Walter Mitty stuff.
But after the turmoil on the currency markets last weekend and the vacuum in policy that's left behind, there are many Conservatives who believe the government should do nothing to fill it, for fear that it will rub salt into wounds not yet healed from the Maastricht encounter. Certainly the Treasury aren't seeking to force the pace on resuscitating John Major's idea of the hard echo. One senior Treasury source said he thought it was too soon to start thinking about what son of VRM should look like, and conceded that the same arguments that led to it being sidelined 3 years ago still apply today. John Sopel, BBC News, Westminster.
Military commanders in Bosnia have met several hours later than expected to discuss terms for Serb forces to withdraw from 2 strategic hilltops overlooking Sarajevo. The Serbs earlier moved some tanks and artillery pieces, but the UN said there was no sign of a serious withdrawal. Jeremy Bowen reports from Sarajevo.
Ratko Mladic, the Serb general, was under pressure to pull his troops back at today's talks, but he knows that General Brikmore, the UN commander, is against airstrikes, so once again the Serbs are confident enough to take the West to the brink. Irma Hadjimuratovic, a 5-year-old Muslim girl, might be dead by the time they get round to talking peace again. She was hit last week by shrapnel from a... But Dr. Yaganyats can't persuade the UN to evacuate her. They've told him that most of the members of the relevant committee who must decide aren't in Sarajevo. It takes weeks, they say, to arrange evacuations. But Irma has only a few days. After so much bloodshed here, it seems it still isn't possible to save children like her.
Countries are not willing to take people who are so unstable. We did fly out a little girl about 3 weeks ago. When we got her to Germany, hospitals there said they wanted $2,000 up front before they were willing to take her. Finally, we found a donor in Belgium, and she was flown into that hospital, but regardless, she still died.
Mr. Hadjimuratovic said it had seemed calm on the day when his wife, Elvira, was killed and his daughter wounded. There hadn't been much shelling, and Irma loves the fresh air, so Elvira took her out to walk and to play. He said he lost his best friend when his wife was killed. He doesn't know what he'll do if Irma dies as well. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Sarajevo.
There's been a big security operation in Belfast where a march has been held marking the 22nd anniversary of internment. Although internment was phased out 18 years ago, the government retains the power to reintroduce it. This year, for the first time, demonstrators were allowed to march into the centre of Belfast. Protestant areas were fenced off while the demonstration took place. A Swedish military jet crashed at an air show in the centre of Stockholm this afternoon, but nobody was killed. The newly developed Saab Griffon was being put through its paces with up to 500,000 people watching. 2 minutes into a low-level display, the pilot appeared to lose control. The plane came down in a residential suburb where a few people needed treatment for minor injuries. The pilot ejected safely and is in hospital with a back injury. The Swedish Prime Minister said it was a miracle. The head of the Palestinian delegation to the Middle East peace talks says 3 senior members of the team are about to resign. But the delegates themselves, who've gone to Tunis to meet the PLO leadership, have refused to confirm or deny the statement. Michael Macmillan reports from Jerusalem.
Hanan Ashrawi, Faisal Husseini and Saab Erekat believe they've been bypassed by Yasser Arafat, and they're fed up with having to refer back to Tunis before negotiating anything with the Israelis. So they're in fighting form. But in Amman today, there was no elaboration on their threat to resign.
We are going to give a report to our leadership on the meetings with Secretary Christopher and to share information and discussions and to work on the future course of things.
Are you denying that you're going to submit your resignation?
We'll talk later.
The US Secretary of State Warren Christopher brought it all to a head last week when he received PLO peace proposals from Yasser Arafat via Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak. The PLO leadership in Jerusalem knew nothing of the document, and when they finally presented their own proposals, there was a significant gulf between the two. Mr. Arafat wants to agree on autonomy for Palestinians on an experimental basis immediately, in exchange for full recognition of the PLO by Israel. These divisions within the PLO do the Israeli government no good at all. They undermine the PLO leadership here and encourage support for the Islamic fundamentalists who are opposed to the peace process. There are many within the Israeli cabinet who now believe that the PLO should be officially recognized to get on with the negotiating process. Michael Macmillan, BBC News in Jerusalem.
The British helicopter pilot, who was sentenced to a year in jail by an Arab court for living with a married woman, has been released on bail. Peter Wade was imprisoned after the authorities in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates were told that he was living with Yvonne Campbell. She's already been freed on bail after spending 2 days in prison with 2 of her children. Dave Lee Travis, one of the BBC's longest-serving disc jockeys, announced his resignation today live on Radio 1. He told his listeners he was unhappy with recent changes at the corporation. The BBC said the news came as a surprise and it was sorry to see him go. Our media correspondent Nick Hyam reports.
What a good way to start off the final half hour of the programme. 25-1, and that's the Rolling Stones with Little Red Rooster. Do you remember?
DLT, the hairy monster of Radio 1 and a DJ on the station almost since its launch more than 25 years ago, made his surprise announcement on the weekend show he's presented since 1980.
And I really want to put the record straight at this point, and I thought that you ought to know first. Changes are being made here that go against my principles, and I just cannot agree with them.
Afterwards, he refused to elaborate on exactly what he disliked about the changes, either at the BBC in general or at Radio 1.
Under current circumstances, I feel the need to leave. It's that simple. And I do it with great regret, because as I said before, I have loved the BBC. I really have loved it.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a very
Dave Lee Travis's BBC career on television as well as radio began in the days when most pop music wasn't the minority taste it's become today, and Radio 1 had little or no competition. Now, commercial radio, most recently Virgin 1215, has squeezed Radio 1's audience, though it's still Britain's most popular station with almost 16 million listeners. Radio 1's been told to become more witty, more alternative and more fun. A new, younger controller takes over in October. He says the network needs to get closer to a younger audience. But DLT, like that other long-serving BBC broadcaster Mark Tully, doesn't like the changes, and like Mark Tully, he's been prepared to say so publicly. Nick Hyam, BBC News.
England are facing almost certain defeat in the 5th Test against Australia at Edgbaston. Despite a century stand between Graham Thorpe and John Embury, they were bowled out for 251 in their second innings. The Australians, needing 120 to win, were 9 without loss at the close.
The plan was to knock off the remaining 43 runs of the deficit without loss, then build a winning lead. A fanciful notion from the moment Smith was harshly adjudged LBW for 19. It was the start of a morning of surrender as abject as anything in England's considerable catalogue of ineptitude. As 5 wickets fell for 21, only Gooch had the excuse of receiving the unplayable. Otherwise, the craftsmanship of Warne and May embarrassingly exposed the inadequacies of England's supposed specialists. But then, with England still 7 behind, with 6 wickets down, John Embury's uniquely eccentric method mounted an extraordinary rescue act, an unlikely flicker, one might say, from the dying embers. Combining as it did with Graham Thorpe's commendable orthodoxy, England were embarked on as bizarre a century stand as they can have compiled. Australia's genuine magicians confounded by Embury's Tommy Cooper. Eventually, with the lead extended to 97, it all came to grief. Embury out for a splendid 37. Soon after, Thorpe perished too for 60, an innings which confirmed him as one of the few successes of the series and which ultimately left Australia needing 120 to win. Realistically, it should be well within their capabilities. Barring bad weather, England are about to go 4 down in the series. Whoever's captain, just now it seems to make little difference. Kevin Geary, BBC News.
And that's it for the moment. The main news tonight is at 10 to 9.
A very good evening to you. Another miserable week for holidaymakers to come, I'm afraid. More rain on its way. In fact, we've already got some rain on the radar, as you can see. That's become rather more patchy, though, as it's pushed its way southeastwards through today. But out in the Atlantic, there's another low-pressure area. That's really going to bring some quite heavy rain in places through tomorrow, and some quite strong winds, too. Now, the rain's going to start to push its way in now. It'll be in across Ireland, I think, in the early hours of the morning. And you can see it pushing its way eastwards then. I think by the end of the night, the heaviest of the rain could be into Glasgow, Belfast, Dublin, perhaps across as far as Manchester as well. But at least it's going to be a mild night. 14 down in the south, 10, I think, up in the north. That's what the weather map's going to look like tomorrow. This is the weather front which is pushing across, bringing that rain and bringing some fairly strong winds too. It's the northwest then that's going to get the heaviest of the rain to start with, misty over the hills as you can see. And a fair amount of cloud elsewhere, little bits of brightness, but equally one or two spots of rain, especially down in the southeast. And then tomorrow, the heaviest of the rain continuing to feed its way eastwards through the morning. Brighter weather coming into this far northwestern part. And as that brighter weather feeds its way southeastwards, getting down in towards the Midlands, I think, by the end of the afternoon. So there'll be a few spots of rain getting down into the southeast as well. A pretty windy day, as I've said, especially in that brighter weather. Quite breezy, quite strong west and northwesterly winds. And that's going to take the edge off the temperatures, most certainly. Only 19 down in the south, only 14 up in the north. That's it. Bye-bye for now.
800 years ago, Europe was on the verge of destruction from a terrifying army from the east. They were the Mongols, annihilating populations from China to the Danube. Whatever they didn't understand, they despised. Whatever they despised, they destroyed. To the Mongols, Genghis Khan was the father of the largest land empire ever built. To the rest of the world, he stood for the rape of civilization. The story of the Mongols and their bid to rule the world is told in a new series, Storm from the East, starting Tuesday, 9:45 on BBC Two.
The wrong way to wake up. Getting out of the wrong side of bed. The right way to wake up. Starting Monday. Tune into Radio 2. And wake up to Wogan.
On Radio 2.
Errol Flynn provides the unlikely inspiration for Compo in 35 minutes with Last of the Summer Wine. First, it's Summer Praise as Pam Rhodes visits a popular North Devon fishing village.